when Samuel Crawford lost everything in a high-stakes poker game in 1867 Kansas. He never imagined his desperate bet to marry the town's spinster daughter would lead to the greatest gamble of his life. But as Molly Briggs transforms not just his crumbling ranch but his hardened heart, Samuel begins to wonder what happens when the woman everyone underestimated becomes the only person worth fighting for. The poker chips clicked like rattlesnake warnings as Samuel Crawford watched his last dollar disappear into Jeremiah Briggs' greedy hands. The Broken Wheel Saloon buzzed with whispers and cigarette smoke on this hot summer night in 1867, but all Samuel could hear was the thunder of his own heartbeat, drowning out everything else in Abilene, Kansas. "Looks like you're cleaned out, boy," Briggs sneered, his gold teeth catching the lamplight like tiny daggers. The older man's fingers drummed against the wooden table, making the empty whiskey bottles dance. "Unless you got something else worth betting with?" Samuel's throat felt drier than the Kansas prairie in August. 3 months of bad luck had cost him everything: his cattle, his savings, even his father's pocket watch. The ranch mortgage papers burned in his coat pocket like a guilty secret, due in just 2 weeks, with no way to pay. Around the smoky room, cowboys and shopkeepers leaned forward in their chairs, sensing drama better than vultures smell death. Old Pete from the general store stroked his gray beard, while the young doctor, William Hayes, adjusted his wire glasses nervously. Even the saloon girls had stopped serving drinks to watch the show. Samuel's desperate eyes swept the room and landed on the corner table where Briggs' daughter sat with her sewing basket. Molly Briggs kept her head down, blonde hair pinned back simply, her needle moving through fabric with steady hands. The townspeople called her the fat daughter, behind her back, whispering that she'd never find a husband, destined to care for her cruel father forever. But Samuel noticed things others missed: the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the cruel words, how her brown eyes flickered with intelligence when she thought nobody was looking, the gentle way she spoke to stray dogs and helped elderly ladies at church. "I'll bet my freedom," Samuel heard himself say, the words tumbling out before his brain could stop them. "If I lose this hand, I'll marry your daughter." The saloon exploded like a dynamite blast. Men jumped to their feet, chairs scraped against wooden floors, and someone dropped a glass that shattered into 1,000 pieces. But through all the noise, Samuel heard one sound that cut through everything else: Molly's sharp intake of breath. Briggs' eyes lit up like Christmas morning. His daughter had turned 25 last month, ancient by frontier standards for unmarried women. Finding her a husband had become his biggest worry, especially with his drinking problem getting worse and his business failing. "Now hold on just a minute." Molly's voice rang out clear and strong as a church bell. She stood up so fast her sewing basket tumbled to the floor, spilling colorful threads everywhere. "I won't be wagered like a prize pig at the county fair." Her cheeks burned red as fresh apples, but her spine stayed straight as a fence post. Samuel had never heard her speak so loudly or with such fire. Usually, she whispered, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," like a ghost afraid of her own shadow. "The boy made his bet fair and square, daughter," Briggs snapped, his voice turning mean as a wounded bear. "Besides, when else will you catch yourself a husband? You should be grateful someone's willing to take you." The cruel words hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Samuel watched Molly's face crumble for just a second before she rebuilt it into something harder and stronger. In that moment, he glimpsed steel beneath her soft appearance, strength that made him question everything he thought he knew about quiet Molly Briggs. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite tears threatening to spill. "But if you lose, Samuel Crawford, you'll learn that some bargains cost more than money." Samuel nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. His hands shook as he arranged his cards, 3 jacks staring back at him like old friends. Not the best hand, but maybe good enough to save his ranch and avoid this crazy marriage bargain. Briggs chuckled and laid down his cards with the flair of a traveling showman. One by one he revealed them: 7, 8, 9, 10, Jack, all hearts. A straight flush gleamed under the oil lamps like blood on snow. The silence stretched longer than Sunday church services. Someone in the back whistled low and long. Another man muttered, "Well, I'll be hanged." Thunder rumbled outside as the first raindrops began tapping against the saloon windows like ghostly fingers. The storm had been building all day, and now it seemed even the sky was weeping for the bargain just made. Samuel stared at the cards, his future suddenly as dark as the storm clouds gathering over Kansas. In one foolish moment, his desperation had changed everything. He gambled away his freedom to a woman he barely knew, all because he couldn't face losing his father's ranch. But as he looked across the room at Molly, still standing tall despite her father's cruelty and the town's whispers, Samuel wondered if maybe he'd been wrong about more than just his poker skills. Maybe there was more to this quiet woman than anyone realized, including himself. The question that would haunt him for days to come echoed in his mind like thunder. What had he really won, and what had he truly lost? 3 days later, Samuel Crawford stood at the altar of Abilene's small wooden church, feeling like a cow being led to slaughter. The year 1867 would be remembered as many things, but for him, it would always be the year he married a stranger because of 5 playing cards. Rain drummed on the roof like an army of tiny hammers, matching the pounding in his chest. His best black suit, the same one he'd worn to bury both parents, felt tight across his shoulders. The small church smelled of wet wood, old prayers, and the wildflowers someone had picked despite the storm. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat and opened his worn Bible, but Samuel barely heard the opening words. His mind kept racing back to the poker game, wondering if there had been any way to change what happened. Maybe if he'd folded earlier. Maybe if he'd never walked into the saloon. Maybe if he'd been brave enough to face his problems instead of gambling them away. The church door creaked open, and every head turned to watch the bride enter. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as Molly appeared in the doorway, transformed by the simple ivory dress she'd sewn herself. She'd woven tiny yellow flowers through her blonde hair, and despite everything, she looked almost beautiful in the soft light filtering through rain-streaked windows. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Instead of the defeat he expected, they held something that looked almost like determination. She walked down the short aisle alone. Her father had declared he had better things to do than watch his daughter collect a debt like some kind of bill collector. The handful of witnesses shifted uncomfortably in their wooden pews. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Catherine Walsh, who ran the general store with her husband, smiled encouragingly at Molly, despite the strange circumstances. Even Dr. Hayes had come, probably worried someone might faint from the tension. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his deep voice filling the small space. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel Crawford and Molly Briggs in holy matrimony." The traditional words felt strange given how they'd ended up here. Samuel glanced sideways at his bride-to-be, noticing details he'd missed in the saloon's dim lighting. Her hands, though fuller than fashionable, moved with an artist's grace. Her skin looked soft as fresh cream, and when she caught him staring, her cheeks turned the color of prairie roses. "I know you don't want this," she whispered as they joined hands for the vows, her skin surprisingly warm against his work-roughened palms. "I don't know what I want anymore," Samuel admitted, and meant every word. The simple touch of her hand sent unexpected tingles up his arm, confusing feelings he wasn't ready to examine. "Do you, Samuel Crawford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison's question hung in the air like morning mist. Samuel's mouth felt stuffed with cotton. Every eye in the church was on him, waiting for his answer. He thought about his ranch, about the mortgage he still couldn't pay, about how this marriage might actually solve some of his problems. But mostly he thought about the woman standing beside him, brave enough to go through with this crazy arrangement, even though she deserved so much better. "I do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And do you, Molly Briggs, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Molly's answer came stronger and clearer than his own. "I do." The ring Samuel slipped onto her finger had belonged to his mother, the only valuable thing he hadn't lost to bad luck or worse decisions. It fit perfectly, as if fate had been planning this moment all along. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel leaned forward to kiss his new bride. Their lips met briefly, formally, but he caught the scent of lavender soap and something else, something warm and comforting that reminded him of his mother's kitchen before the world had turned cold and lonely. As they signed the marriage certificate, Molly's hand stayed steady, while Samuel's shook like a leaf in a windstorm. Mrs. Henderson sniffled loudly, and Catherine Walsh started clapping, which made everyone else join in with polite but puzzled applause. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, and weak sunlight struggled through the breaking clouds. Samuel helped Molly into the borrowed wagon that would take them to his ranch, their new home together. As they settled onto the hard wooden seat, she surprised him by speaking first. "I want you to know something, Samuel Crawford," she said, arranging her skirts carefully around her legs. "I didn't agree to this marriage just because my father wanted it, or because the town thinks I'm too old and fat to get a husband any other way." Samuel turned to look at her, startled by the steel in her quiet voice. "I agreed because I've been watching you for months, ever since you started coming to town more often. I've seen how you treat animals gently, how you tip your hat to ladies regardless of their age or looks, how you helped old Mrs. Peterson fix her fence without asking for payment." She met his eyes directly, unflinching. "I agreed, because I think underneath all that gambling and drinking and self-pity, there's a good man worth saving." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Nobody had called him a good man in so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. His throat tightened with emotions he couldn't name as they rode toward his ranch in companionable silence, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the distant rumble of departing thunder. As they crested the hill that revealed his modest homestead in the valley below, Samuel wondered if maybe this strange marriage might turn out to be something neither of them expected. But first, they had to figure out how to live together as strangers who had promised to be husband and wife. The church bell rang 3 times that morning, but nobody in Abilene knew if it was calling people to witness a wedding or a funeral. Samuel Crawford stood outside the small wooden church, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't button his black jacket properly. The same suit had seen him through his father's burial just 2 years before, and now it would see him through what felt like his own. "You don't have to go through with this," whispered Doc Henderson, the only man in town brave enough to stand as Samuel's witness. The old doctor had delivered half the babies in Abilene and buried the other half's grandparents, so he knew something about life's strange turns. Samuel looked down the dusty main street toward the Briggs house, where smoke curled from the chimney like a question mark against the gray sky. "A man keeps his word, Doc, even when that word was spoken in foolishness." The year 1867 had already brought enough surprises to last Samuel a lifetime, but this morning promised to deliver the biggest shock yet. Through the church's open door, he could see Reverend Morrison arranging flowers on the altar, wildflowers that someone had picked from the prairie before dawn, their petals still heavy with dew. Inside the church, the wooden pews held maybe 20 people, all whispering like leaves in a windstorm. Mrs. Patterson from the general store sat in the front row, fanning herself with a hymnal and shaking her head every few seconds. Behind her, 3 cowboys from the Johnson Ranch had wandered in from the saloon, still smelling of whiskey and curiosity. "Here she comes," Doc Henderson said, and every head in the church turned toward the door. Molly Briggs appeared like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Her dress wasn't fancy, just simple white cotton that she'd sewn herself during the 3 long days since the poker game. But something about the way she wore it made Samuel forget to breathe. Her blonde hair was braided with those same prairie wildflowers, and when she smiled at the small crowd, her whole face lit up like a lantern. But what struck Samuel most wasn't how she looked, it was how she walked. Molly didn't shuffle down that aisle like a woman being led to her doom. She walked with her head high, her shoulders straight, like she was choosing this moment instead of having it chosen for her. Her father wasn't there to give her away. Jeremiah Briggs had declared he was too busy counting his winnings to waste time on wedding ceremonies. So Molly walked alone, and somehow that made her seem stronger, not weaker. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel Crawford and Molly Briggs in holy matrimony." Samuel tried to focus on the words, but his mind kept wandering to the woman standing beside him. Up close, he could see details he'd missed in the saloon's dim light. Her hands, folded calmly in front of her, showed small scars from years of cooking and sewing. Her eyes, which he'd thought were plain brown, actually held flecks of gold that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. When it came time for the vows, Molly spoke first, her voice clear and steady. "I promise to be your wife, Samuel Crawford, in whatever way that means to both of us. I promise to work beside you, to speak truthfully to you, and to build something good from this strange beginning we've been given." The words weren't the traditional ones Reverend Morrison usually heard, but they carried more weight than 100 memorized promises. Samuel found his own voice, somewhere deep in his chest. I promise to try to be worthy of your trust, Molly Briggs. I promise to work hard to make up for the foolish way this all started, and to treat you with the respect you deserve, even when I'm still learning what that means. When they joined hands for the ring ceremony, Samuel noticed that Molly's fingers were warm and sure, while his own felt cold and uncertain. The simple gold band, his mother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing he still owned, slipped onto Molly's finger like it had been made for her. You may kiss the bride, Reverend Morrison announced, and suddenly the church fell so quiet you could hear dust settling on the pews. Samuel leaned forward, meaning to give Molly just a quick, polite kiss to satisfy the ceremony's requirements. But when their lips met, something unexpected happened. For just a moment, the world stopped spinning. The whispers from the pews faded away, the smell of wildflowers filled his senses, and Samuel felt something he couldn't name stirring in his chest. When they pulled apart, Molly's cheeks were pink, but her eyes held a spark that hadn't been there before. Well, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. That wasn't so terrible, was it? Despite everything, the gambling debt, the unwanted marriage, the uncertain future, Samuel found himself almost smiling. No, he admitted, it wasn't terrible at all. As they walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife Samuel caught sight of their reflection in the church's front window. They looked like a real couple, he realized with surprise. Not like two strangers forced together by a foolish bet, but like two people who might actually have chosen each other. Outside the church, Mrs. Patterson pressed a basket of fresh bread into Molly's hands. For your first supper as a married woman, she said, her voice gentler than usual. Marriage is hard work, child, but it can be good work if you both put your backs into it. Doc Henderson slapped Samuel on the shoulder. You got yourself a fine woman there, son. Don't you go messing it up with your stubborn pride. As the small crowd dispersed, heading back to their own lives and problems, Samuel helped Molly into the borrowed wagon that would take them to his ranch. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist and promising a hot day ahead. Are you ready for this? Samuel asked as he took the reins, not entirely sure what this meant anymore. Molly settled beside him on the wagon seat, arranging her simple white dress carefully. I've been ready for something to change for a long time, Samuel Crawford. I just never imagined it would happen quite like this. As they rolled out of Abilene toward Samuel's ranch, neither of them spoke about the biggest question hanging in the air between them. Now what? The first thing Molly noticed about Samuel's ranch wasn't the house or the barn or the fields that needed tending. It was the silence. Not the good kind of quiet that comes with peaceful mornings or restful evenings, but the heavy, sad silence of a place where nobody had laughed in a very long time. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle but uncertain on her waist. It's not much to look at, he said, his voice carrying the weight of apology. I know, it's not what most women would want. Molly stood in the dusty yard, taking in the sight of what would now be her home. The house was small and weathered, its wooden walls gray from years of Kansas wind and sun. The porch sagged on one side, and several windows were patched with cloth instead of glass. Weeds grew wild around the foundation, and the fence around what had once been a vegetable garden lay broken in several places. But Molly had spent her whole life looking past surfaces to see what lay underneath. Where Samuel saw failure, she saw possibility. It has good bones, she said, running her hand along the porch railing. The wood was solid under the peeling paint, and the roof looked sound despite its worn shingles. And look at all this space for a garden. Samuel watched her face carefully, waiting for disappointment to creep in. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like excitement. You're not upset? About what? Having a home of my own for the first time in my life? Molly gathered her skirts and climbed the porch steps, testing each board carefully. Samuel, I've spent 24 years living in my father's house, following his rules, listening to him tell me I was too fat, too plain, too useless to ever have a place of my own. This may not be a palace, but it's mine now too, isn't it? The question hung in the air, as Samuel fumbled with the front door key. He hadn't thought about ownership, about sharing. For 2 years since his parents' death, this place had been his burden alone. The idea of it belonging to someone else, even partially, felt strange and frightening and somehow hopeful all at once. Inside, the house told the story of a man who had forgotten how to live instead of just survive. Dust covered every surface thick as winter frost. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin, growing things that might once have been food. The windows were so dirty they barely let in light, and the few pieces of furniture were arranged without thought or care. Molly walked slowly through the 3 small rooms, kitchen, sitting area, and bedroom, her wedding dress brushing against surfaces that hadn't seen a woman's touch since Samuel's mother died. She didn't say anything about the mess, didn't wrinkle her nose at the smell of old bacon grease and unwashed clothes. She just observed everything with those careful brown eyes. "Where should I put my things?" she asked finally, setting down the single carpet bag that held everything she owned. Samuel realized he hadn't thought about sleeping arrangements. The house had only 1 bedroom, 1 bed. Heat crept up his neck as he stammered, You can have the bedroom. I'll sleep on the floor in here." "Don't be silly," Molly said practically. "It's your house, your bed. We're married now, aren't we? Besides," she added with a small smile, "the bed's big enough for 2 people who are trying to be polite to each other." That evening, as the sun painted the prairie sky in shades of orange and pink, Molly began the work of making the house livable. She found an old broom and started sweeping, humming softly as she worked. Samuel watched from the doorway, amazed by how different the place felt with someone else moving through it. "You don't have to do all this," he said when she began washing dishes with water heated over the fire. "I know," Molly replied, scrubbing at a plate that might have been white once upon a time. "But I want to. This is my home now too, and I'd like it to feel like one." Samuel picked up a dish towel and began drying the clean plates, working beside her in comfortable quiet. It was the first time in months that he'd felt useful for something other than worrying about debts and failures. As they worked, Molly asked questions about the ranch. How many acres? What crops grew best? Where the property lines ran? Her interest seemed genuine, not just polite conversation. When Samuel mentioned that his father had always talked about expanding the vegetable garden, Molly's eyes lit up. "I love gardening," she said. "My father never let me plant anything except what we needed for meals, but I always dreamed of having flowers, maybe some herbs for cooking." "You can plant whatever you want," Samuel said, and meant it. "The land's not good for much else anyway." That night, they lay in the same bed but as far apart as the mattress would allow, both staring at the ceiling and listening to each other breathe. The awkwardness stretched between them like a fence neither knew how to climb. "Samuel?" Molly's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for not making this harder than it has to be. I know this isn't what you wanted." Samuel turned toward her voice, though he couldn't see her face in the dark. "It's not what either of us wanted. But maybe it doesn't have to be terrible." "Maybe not," Molly agreed, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the prairie grass, and for the first time since his parents died, Samuel Crawford fell asleep in a house that didn't feel completely empty. The next morning, he woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. Real coffee. Not the burnt grain mixture he'd been choking down for months. Molly stood at the stove, already dressed and working, her hair braided neatly down her back. "Good morning, husband," she said. And somehow the word didn't sound as strange as it had the day before. The rooster's crow mixed with the sound of sizzling bacon as Samuel woke to smells he'd forgotten could exist in his kitchen. 6 weeks had passed since their wedding in 1867, and every morning brought new surprises that made him question everything he thought he knew about marriage, about Molly, and about himself. Stumbling from his bedroom in wrinkled clothes, Samuel found his wife already dressed and busy at the stove, her blonde hair pinned back with small blue ribbons she'd sewn herself. The kitchen that had once been a place of cold meals and dirty dishes now gleamed with cleanliness, herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and fresh bread cooling on the wooden table. "Morning, sleepyhead," Molly said without turning around, her voice carrying a warmth that made something flutter in Samuel's chest. "Coffee's ready, and I've got eggs from the new chickens." "New chickens?" Samuel rubbed his eyes, still not fully awake. Molly spun around with a grin that transformed her entire face. making her look years younger than her 24 summers. I traded Mrs. Henderson 3 embroidered pillowcases for 6 laying hens and a rooster. Pete Hansen threw in some feed sacks when I fixed the tear in his Sunday shirt. Samuel stared at his wife as she bustled around the kitchen, her movements quick and sure. In just 6 weeks, she'd managed to accomplish more than he had in the past year. The realization should have made him feel useless, but instead, it filled him with something he couldn't quite name. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, accepting the steaming cup of coffee she pressed into his hands. "I know," Molly replied, her brown eyes meeting his directly. "But I wanted to. This is my home now, too." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Home. When had anyone last called this place home? When had he last thought of it as anything more than a shelter from the world's cruelty? After breakfast, Samuel watched from the porch as Molly worked in what she'd decided would become their vegetable garden. She'd marked out neat rows with pieces of string and wooden stakes, her movements careful and planned. The sight of her kneeling in the dirt, her dress tucked around her knees, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, stirred something protective in his chest. "What are you planting?" he asked, walking over to where she worked. "Beans, corn, squash," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "The 3 sisters, my grandmother called them. They help each other grow." Samuel knelt beside her, studying the small seeds in her palm. "How do they help each other?" Molly's face lit up with the joy of sharing knowledge. "The corn gives the beans something to climb. The beans put goodness back in the soil, and the squash leaves keep the weeds away. Each one makes the other stronger." As she spoke, Samuel found himself watching her mouth, the way her lips curved around words, the small dimple that appeared in her left cheek when she smiled. When had he started noticing such things? "Samuel," Molly's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're staring." Heat rushed to his face. "Sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" The honest curiosity in her voice made him want to tell the truth, but the words felt too dangerous, too revealing. Instead, he picked up a handful of seeds. "About planting. I never thought much about how things grow together." That afternoon brought their first real test as a working partnership. Samuel was mending fence posts when he heard Molly's cry of alarm from the chicken coop. Racing across the yard, he found her cornering a large fox that had somehow gotten inside and was eyeing the new hens with obvious hunger. "Get back," Samuel ordered, reaching for his rifle. "Wait," Molly said, her voice calm despite the situation. "Look at him." Samuel paused, following her gaze to the fox. The animal was thin, its ribs showing through patchy fur, and one of its back legs seemed injured. "He's not trying to kill for sport," Molly continued softly. "He's just hungry and hurt." "Molly, it's a fox. It'll kill every chicken we have." "I know," she said, never taking her eyes off the animal. "But maybe we can find another way." What followed was the strangest half hour of Samuel's life. While he kept the rifle ready, Molly slowly approached the fox, speaking in low, gentle tones. She'd grabbed a piece of bacon from the kitchen, and she offered it to the animal while backing toward the open coop door. Impossibly, the fox followed the food instead of attacking the chickens, limping out of the coop and into the yard. Molly tossed the bacon a safe distance from the house, and the fox grabbed it before disappearing into the tall grass. "That was the most foolish thing I've ever seen," Samuel said, but his voice held more admiration than anger. Molly straightened, her face flushed with excitement and fear. Maybe. But sometimes foolish things work out. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. The woman beside him hummed softly as she worked on a piece of embroidery, her needle catching the last rays of sunlight. "Molly," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Why did you really marry me?" Her hands stilled, and she looked up from her sewing. For a long moment, the only sounds were the evening breeze rustling through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. "Because," she said finally, "I saw something in your eyes that night in the saloon. Something I recognized." "What was that?" "The same thing I saw in my own mirror every morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone who'd forgotten they were worth more than other people's opinions. The honesty of her words made Samuel's chest tight. He'd spent so long thinking of their marriage as a punishment, a consequence of his own stupidity. But sitting here beside this remarkable woman who'd transformed his house into a home, who'd negotiated with foxes and traded embroidery for chickens, who'd somehow made him feel less alone than he had in years, Samuel began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, losing that poker game had been the luckiest thing that ever happened to him. "What if I told you," he said carefully, "that I'm starting to think the same thing?" Molly's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, warm and full of promise. "Then I'd say we're both learning what it means to win when you think you've lost everything." The morning heat was already brutal when Samuel spotted the dust cloud on the eastern horizon, and something about the way it moved made his stomach clench with dread. 3 riders, moving fast and with purpose toward his ranch. Beside him, Molly continued hanging wet shirts on the clothesline, but he could see the tension in her shoulders as she watched the approaching figures. "Do you know them?" she asked quietly, her hands never pausing in their work. Samuel squinted against the harsh July sun, his heart sinking as the riders drew close enough to identify. "The one in front is Buck Morrison, Reverend's younger brother. The one who came back from the war different?" Molly's voice held no judgment, just careful attention. "That's him." Samuel moved closer to his wife, noting how she'd positioned herself near the laundry basket, where she kept the heavy wooden pins. Even doing chores, Molly thought like someone who'd learned to be ready for trouble. "The other 2 I don't recognize, but they've got the look of men who solve problems with bullets." The 3 riders reined in their horses just outside the fence line, close enough to talk but far enough to make a quick escape if needed. Buck Morrison sat his horse like a man who'd forgotten how to relax, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. The war had taken something essential from him and left behind someone Samuel barely recognized as the boy who'd once helped ring the church bells. "Sam Crawford!" Buck's voice carried across the hot air like a challenge. "Heard you came into some good fortune lately." Samuel stepped protectively in front of Molly, though she showed no signs of hiding behind him. "Buck, what brings you out this way in such heat?" Buck's eyes moved past Samuel to where Molly stood with a damp shirt clutched in her hands, and his smile held nothing friendly. "Oh, I think you know exactly what brings me here. Word travels fast in a territory like Kansas. Man wins himself a wife who can cook and clean and keep a house proper. Well, that's the kind of news that gets around." The 2 men flanking Buck shifted in their saddles, and Samuel caught the glint of metal as one adjusted his gun belt. These weren't social visitors. "Figured you might be willing to share some of that domestic bliss," continued one of Buck's companions, a thin man with pale eyes and nervous hands. "We've been riding hard since dawn, and we're mighty hungry for some home cooking." Samuel felt Molly move slightly behind him, but it wasn't the movement of someone seeking protection. It was the careful repositioning of someone preparing for a fight. The realization sent both pride and fear coursing through his veins. "I'm sure the hotel in town would be happy to feed you," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "Mrs. Patterson sets a fine table." "Now that's not very neighborly," Buck said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "Besides, we're not looking for just any cooking. We want to sample what's got you looking so satisfied lately." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Samuel felt his jaw clench, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Behind him, he heard the soft whisper of Molly's skirts as she moved, and when she spoke, her voice carried a steel he'd never heard before. "This is our land," she said, stepping up beside Samuel with something dark and heavy gripped in her right hand. Samuel glanced down and nearly smiled despite the danger. She'd armed herself with the cast-iron skillet from their morning bacon, and she held it like someone who knew exactly how much damage it could do. "You'll treat it, and us, with respect, or you'll leave. Your choice." Buck's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Well, well, seems your wife's got more backbone than you do, Crawford. Question is, what's she willing to do to protect this cozy little setup you 2 have built?" The situation balanced on a knife's edge, tension thick as prairie humidity. Samuel could feel sweat beating on his forehead, but beside him, Molly stood steady as a rock, her breathing calm and controlled. Where had this fierce woman been hiding during all those quiet weeks of domestic harmony? "The lady asked you to leave," Samuel said, reaching slowly for the rifle he'd left leaning against the porch post. Every movement felt crucial, weighted with consequences that could change everything. "Now, hold on there, friend," said the 3rd rider, a bearded man with quick eyes and quicker hands. His gun was already halfway out of its holster, metal singing against leather in the hot air. What happened next shattered every assumption Samuel had made about his gentle wife. As the gunman's weapon cleared leather, Molly moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years hitting targets. Chickens stealing from gardens, rats raiding root cellars, problems that couldn't be solved with words or wishes. The cast-iron skillet flew from her hand like a stone from a sling, spinning end over end through the shimmering heat. It connected with the gunman's wrist with a solid crack that echoed across the prairie, and his pistol went flying into the dust as he cursed and grabbed his injured hand. In the same heartbeat, Samuel brought his rifle to bear, the familiar weight settling into his hands like an old friend returning home. Suddenly, the odds had shifted dramatically in their favor. "I believe my wife made herself clear," Samuel said, and his voice carried an authority he hadn't felt since before his parents died and left him drowning in debts and desperation. "This is our home, and you're not welcome here." Buck Morrison looked back and forth between the rifle barrel pointed at his chest and Molly, who'd already retrieved her skillet and stood ready to use it again. His pale companion nursed his injured wrist while glaring hatred at the woman who'd disarmed him with kitchen equipment. "This ain't over, Crawford," Buck snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "You can't hide behind your wife's skirts forever." "I'm not hiding behind anything," Samuel replied calmly. "I'm standing beside someone worth standing with." As the three riders galloped away, leaving only dust and the echo of threats behind them, Samuel turned to find Molly watching him with an expression he'd never seen before. Pride, certainly, but something deeper, too. Something that made his chest tight and his hands tremble as he set down the rifle. "That was quite a throw," he said, his voice rough with leftover adrenaline. Molly looked down at the skillet in her hands, then back up at him with a smile that was part embarrassment, part satisfaction. "Father always said I had good aim when I was motivated. Remind me never to make you angry in the kitchen," Samuel said, and despite everything, found himself laughing. The sound seemed to break the last of the tension, and Molly laughed too, high and bright against the vast Kansas sky. But as their laughter faded and they stood together in the aftermath of violence narrowly avoided, Samuel realized something fundamental had changed between them. They'd faced danger together, protected something precious together, and in doing so had become something more than just two people sharing a house. They'd become partners in the truest sense, and that realization was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The crack of gunfire split the morning air like thunder, but it wasn't Samuel's rifle that spoke first. Buck Morrison's horse reared as a warning shot kicked up dirt inches from its hooves, and every man froze as they realized the bullet had come from an unexpected direction entirely. "That's far enough, boys." Sheriff Tom Brennan emerged from behind the barn, his silver badge catching the sunlight as he kept his smoking pistol trained on the three intruders. His weathered face showed the kind of calm that came from 20 years of dealing with troublemakers. "Seems like you forgot this. Here's private property." Buck's face twisted with rage and surprise. "This ain't your business, Sheriff. Just having a neighborly visit." "Funny thing about neighborly visits," Brennan drawled, never lowering his weapon. "They usually don't require 3 armed men and threats." His steely eyes shifted to Samuel. "Got word in town that some unsavory types might be heading this way. Thought I'd ride out and check on our newlyweds." Samuel felt his grip on the rifle steady as hope flickered in his chest, but Molly surprised everyone by stepping forward, her makeshift weapon still clutched in both hands. "Sheriff Brennan, these men came onto our land making demands and speaking disrespectfully about our home," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. "They refused to leave when asked politely." The shortest of Buck's companions, a man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Look, we didn't mean no real harm, just heard tell of good cooking and thought—" "You thought wrong," Molly interrupted, and Samuel noticed how her stance had changed. Gone was the quiet woman who'd sewn in the corner of the saloon. In her place stood someone who'd found her voice and wasn't afraid to use it. "This land belongs to my husband and me. We work hard for what we have, and we don't owe anyone our hospitality." Sheriff Brennan nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Crawford speaks true. Now, Buck Morrison, you and your friends have 2 choices. You can mount up and ride out peaceful-like, or you can explain to Judge Harrison why you were threatening honest folk on their own property." The tension stretched like a bowstring as Buck weighed his options. Samuel watched the man's face cycle through anger, calculation, and finally, resignation. But just as it seemed the confrontation might end without violence, the scarred man made a mistake that changed everything. His hand dropped toward his gun. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats that felt like hours. Sheriff Brennan's pistol swung toward the new threat. Buck spurred his horse forward, thinking to escape in the confusion, and Samuel brought his rifle to bear on the nearest target. But it was Molly who acted with the kind of split-second decisiveness that saved lives. The cast-iron skillet left her hands like a cannonball, striking the scarred man's wrist just as his fingers closed around his gun grip. The weapon tumbled harmlessly into the dust as the man howled in pain, clutching his injured arm to his chest. "Nobody moves." Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. His gun swept from man to man, and suddenly the three would-be troublemakers found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. "That's assault with intent to harm, boys. Judge Harrison's going to have plenty to say about that." Samuel kept his rifle trained on Buck Morrison, but his eyes kept drifting to his wife. The morning sun caught the gold threads in her brown hair, and her face showed a fierce determination he'd never seen before. She stood with her feet planted wide, ready to fight for what was theirs, and something deep in Samuel's chest clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. "This ain't over, Crawford," Buck snarled as the sheriff began collecting weapons. "You think hiding behind your woman and the law makes you safe?" "I think," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of new understanding, "that underestimating my wife is the first mistake you made today. Won't be making it again." Sheriff Brennan chuckled as he bound the scarred man's hands with rope from his saddlebags. "Smart words, Samuel. Mrs. Crawford, that was some fine throwing. Where'd you learn to handle a skillet like that?" Molly's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice remained steady. "Years of chasing chickens out of the garden and rats from the root cellar. You learn to hit what you're aiming for, or you go hungry." As the three troublemakers were herded away under the sheriff's watchful eye, Samuel found himself alone with his wife in the sudden quiet that followed violence. The morning seemed brighter somehow, the colors more vivid, as if the confrontation had washed the world clean. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, setting down his rifle and turning to face her fully. Molly looked down at the dented skillet in her hands, then back up at him. "I wasn't going to let them take what we've built. This place, this life, it's ours now. Worth fighting for." The simple words hit Samuel harder than any physical blow. For the first time since that night in the saloon, he understood that what had begun as a desperate gamble had grown into something neither of them had expected. They weren't just sharing a house anymore, they were building a future together, one difficult day at a time. "You're right," he said, reaching out to take her free hand in both of his. "It is worth fighting for." As they walked back toward the house together, Samuel realized that the scared, desperate man who'd lost everything at a poker table was gone. In his place stood someone who'd found something more valuable than money or pride, a partner who would stand beside him when trouble came calling, and a home worth defending with everything he had. 3 months after the confrontation with Buck Morrison, Samuel Crawford stood in his kitchen doorway, watching his wife paint by lamplight, and marveled at how completely his world had changed since that poker game in 1867. The small canvas propped on the table showed their vegetable garden in full autumn glory, but Molly had added something that didn't exist yet, a white picket fence and a tire swing hanging from the old oak tree. "You're painting things that haven't happened," he observed, settling into the chair beside her. Molly dipped her brush in a mixture of yellow and brown, creating the perfect shade of prairie grass. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm painting things that could happen if we're brave enough to make them real." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the Kansas plains in white. The house felt warm and solid around them, filled with the sense of Molly's cooking and the sound of wind chimes she'd made from old horseshoes. Samuel had grown used to these evening moments, when the day's work was done and they could simply exist together in comfortable quiet. "I've been thinking about what you said that day," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about choosing who we want to become instead of staying trapped by who we were." Molly set down her brush and turned to give him her full attention. In the lamplight, her face looked different than it had that first night in the saloon, more confident, more settled in her own skin. And what have you decided? Samuel reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. I went to see Lawyer Phillips in town yesterday. Had him draw something up. He handed her the document, his heart beating fast as she unfolded it. Molly's eyes widened as she read, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the legal language. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. You're giving me half ownership of the ranch? I'm giving you what should have been yours from the beginning, Samuel corrected. This place isn't mine anymore, it's ours. Everything we've built, everything we're going to build, we do it together as equal partners. The paper crinkled in Molly's hands as she set it aside and moved closer to him. Samuel, you don't need to do this to prove anything. I already chose to stay. I already chose us. I know, he said, reaching up to touch her face. But I need to choose too. Really choose. Not just accept what happened. I need to tell you that if I could go back to that poker game, knowing everything I know now, I'd make the same bet. Not because I was desperate, but because it brought me to you. The snow continued falling outside their kitchen window as Molly leaned into his touch. You know what the funny thing is? Everyone in town still talks about how you lost that poker game, but they don't understand what you actually won. Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. What did I win? A partner who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself. A home that's built on choice instead of obligation. A future that we get to create together, one day at a time. She gestured toward her painting, where the imagined fence and swing waited to be made real, and the knowledge that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as losses. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill. Samuel thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, convinced that luck was something that happened to other people. He'd been so focused on what he was losing that he'd missed what he was gaining. I want to learn to paint, he said suddenly. Molly blinked in surprise. Really? You see things differently than I do, beautiful things that I miss. He picked up one of her brushes, testing its weight in his work-roughened fingers. Maybe if I learn to see the way you see, I'll understand even more about what we're building here. The smile that spread across Molly's face was brighter than the lamplight, and Samuel knew he'd said exactly the right thing. Not because he was trying to please her, but because he meant it. She'd shown him that creation could be just as satisfying as preservation, that making something beautiful was its own kind of strength. Tomorrow, she said, pulling a fresh canvas from her supplies, we'll start with the basics. How to mix colors, how to see light and shadow. But tonight, she moved to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered prairie. Tonight, let's just watch winter come to our land. Samuel joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched the snow transform the familiar landscape into something magical and new. This was their first winter together as truly married partners, and he found himself looking forward to all the seasons to come. The springs when they'd plant new gardens, the summers when they'd work side by side under the Kansas sun, the autumns when they'd harvest what they'd sown together. Molly, he said softly, thank you for teaching me the difference between losing a bet and winning a life. She leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and real. Thank you for being brave enough to let me. Outside, the snow continued to fall on their little piece of Kansas, covering the past and preparing the ground for whatever would grow there come spring. And inside their warm kitchen, two people who'd found each other through the strangest of circumstances began planning the beautiful, ordinary future they'd choose to build together, one brushstroke at a time.